Good evening. To you, listening from your snow-covered bed in Kazan. From a quiet home in Fez, whose window opens to a spice-scented alley. From a small courtyard in Karachi, where the call to prayer blends with the first footsteps of the day. And to you, lying in a modest, peaceful room in Mataram, brushing the night with half-closed eyes. Here we meet again, in a sleep that is unrushed, in a story that does not disturb, only slow breaths, gentle words, and a journey that drifts like a whisper. Tonight, we will listen to the story of a calligrapher, one who wrote only when the world was still stirring from darkness. He never borrowed the hours of the day, for to him, the truest ink only flowed. When the sky still cradled the last prayers of the night, pull your blanket a little closer, let your breath fall softly, and allow us to read to you a story that could only be written at dawn. In an old city rarely mentioned on the maps of the present day, tucked between the fading footprints of caravan trails and the first call to prayer from a minaret crumbling with time, lived a man named Khalid ibn Azraq. He was not a scholar nor a poet, though he was a dear friend to both. He was a calligrapher, one who chose the quietest hour of the day to write, the fragile moment when the night had not yet departed and the morning had not fully arrived. Khalid accepted no commissions. He wrote for no reward, no request. His paper was hand-pressed from the bark of palmyra trees, his ink carefully mixed from the soot of oil lamps, and each letter he formed was the result of long contemplation. Resting somewhere between sleep and prayer, some claimed they had seen a faint light escape his window at the exact moment of the dawn call to prayer, as if the words he penned carried their own kind of glow. His house was modest, mud-walled, nestled in a corner of the old market that only stirred to life by late morning. No one paid much attention to Khalid during the day, for he would always be asleep when the city awoke. But every dawn, between the rustle of wind and the soft steps of the mosque's first caretaker, the city kept a quiet secret. A man who wrote letters only when time itself was too shy to show its face. To Khalid, calligraphy was never mere ornament. He believed every letter carried a soul, and that ink was not a tool, but a bridge between the fleeting and the eternal. He never rushed his hand, just a few lines each morning, and spent the rest of the day in quiet remembrance, mending brushes, or simply sitting in thought under the dim light of a clay lantern. People around him often wondered, why doesn't he sell his work? Why not use such talent to earn a living? But Khalid would only smile and reply, what price can I place on letters descended from the heavens? Once, a wealthy merchant from Damascus arrived, offering a handsome sum for a single piece of Khalid's writing, an inscription mounted on a mosque wall. It was only one verse, written in deep crimson ink on an ivory yellow background. Wa ashubi itzatanafas. By the dawn as it breathes, Khalid gently declined. This verse is not for sale, he said softly, just as the dawn cannot be bought. And so the stories about him began to spread, from mouth to mouth, from one madrasa to the next. Children began to imitate him, writing before sunrise with soot ink, copying verses or hadiths onto scraps of old paper. Some were drawn to the beauty of the script, but others began to sense that what mattered most was not the form of the letters, but the stillness of the hour in which they were written. One morning, as the city lay beneath a thin veil of mist and the crow of roosters was still faint and distant, Khalid opened the small window of his workroom. The air outside was biting cold, yet he smiled. On the old wooden desk before him, a single sheet of white paper waited, and within Khalid's mind, a line began to form. What you write in the light of dawn will endure longer than anything written under the glare of noon. Then his brush touched the ink, and the day began. The mist had not yet lifted that morning when Anwar stepped out into the alleyway in front of his home, something he hadn't done in years. He carried no walking stick, nor did he wear the turban he used to wrap around his head in his younger days. He only held a single blank sheet of paper in his hand and a small pen tucked inside the sleeve of his robe. He didn't know why he walked, but each step felt like a calling, like an unfinished piece of calligraphy, demanding to be completed. Step by step, he searched for the trace of the young man who had stood, gazing at his home just before dawn. A silhouette that had stirred something in his heart he hadn't felt since Malik disappeared. The alleyways of Baghdad were still quiet. The morning air carried the scent of incense from slightly opened windows. White cloths hung like half-answered prayers. Anwar passed a soup vendor kindling his fire and a little girl sweeping the front of an old bookshop. They looked at him, but didn't greet him. Anwar felt like a dream moving through them. Real, but not entirely present. In his mind, he heard young Malik's voice again, the way he used to ask, "Father, why do we never have a map?" And he would always answer, "Because the way home doesn't need a map, only memory." That day, he followed an unwritten path, a road not marked by habit. He turned down a narrow lane he had never entered before, walking through parts of the city that had changed yet still held shadows of the past. There was an old well near Masjid al-Mahmudi, the place where he had once taught Malik to read the letter Alif for the very first time. He stopped there. The water was no longer as clear as it used to be, but when he looked down, he saw his reflection, and behind it faintly, almost hidden within his own shadow, he saw Malik's face, young, smiling. And there, he found again the trace long thought lost. The young man he had seen from his window at dawn was now sitting on the stone steps of the mosque. He wasn't reading, nor sleeping, just sitting still, staring at the stone floor scattered with fallen leaves. He wore a worn-out robe, and on his cheek was a small scar, just like the one Malik had after falling from the pomegranate tree in their yard 20 years ago. Anwar couldn't move. He wanted to cry out, but something in his chest locked his voice. He simply stood there, letting the wind speak in his place. The young man turned 30, slowly, like a letter hesitant to be read. His eyes were dark but not empty, and in that gaze, Anwar knew he was not Malik, but he carried something of Malik. "Are you Anwar ibn Radi?" the young man asked. His voice was deep, Yet a trembling note made Anwar clutch the blank paper in his hand more tightly. "I know that name. From my father," the young man continued. "My name is Nur. My father once traveled with a trade caravan to Khorasan. He used to speak of someone who wrote like he was praying. He said he owed that man a message." Anwar slowly sat beside him. His knees were tired, but his heart was more so. "Who was your father?" he asked, his voice cracking like old paper. Nab pulled something from his cloth pouch. A small weathered piece of calligraphy, tied with a yellow thread. Anwar took it with trembling hands. When he opened it, he saw a short verse from Surah Al-Inshirah, written in a style of script he had only ever used once in his life. Indeed, with hardship, there is ease. He had written it for Malik and given it to him the morning before he left. "My father kept it until the day he died," Nu said. "He told me this calligraphy saved his life when our caravan was attacked on the journey home. He was gravely wounded, but survived, because each night he would read these words as if they were his mother's prayers. And before he passed, he told me, 'Find the man who wrote this. He is not just a writer. He is searching for his son, and I carry part of the answer.'" Anwar closed his eyes. The morning wind brushed his face, and among the whispering leaves, he heard Malik's voice. "Father, write something for those who come after me." That day, Anwar returned home, carrying an old piece of calligraphy and a new promise. He would begin to write again, not only for Malik, but for all the sons who left and never returned, and for all the fathers who waited without knowing when the waiting would end. He would write about loss, about time that cannot be turned back, and about dawns that always come, even when the night refuses to end. And for the first time in years, he opened a fresh page in his little notebook. He wrote, "Every child who goes missing is a verse not yet fully read. Some letters are not born of the tongue, but of wounds. Letters that are not pronounced, only felt." Anwar had begun to write again. But this time, not on silk scrolls or paper from Samarkand. He wrote on coarse sheets he found among piles of old archives. He wrote during quiet hours, just before sunrise, when the world still twisted in sleep and the first call to prayer had not yet echoed from the minarets. He did not write for praise, nor for the calligraphy sellers in the market. He wrote for the children lost in history, for the fathers who had lost their way, for the nights without a closing and the mornings that arrived too soon. Each dawn, he opened the small window of his writing room. The fog would greet him like an old friend, wrapping itself around his desk and the little oil lamp that always threatened to die out. His feathered pen, aged with time, still danced faithfully across the page, like light rain upon a lake, and each time the ink flowed, he felt as though he was stitching together something long broken. Letter by letter, not as ornament, but as remembrance. One evening, as he burned incense to quiet his thoughts, Nu returned. "I read your writing," he said, his voice gentle, as if afraid to wake a memory. "Which one?" Anwar asked without turning. "The one on your window table," about the lost child. Anwar gave a faint smile. That is not writing. That is a question, he replied. And I don't yet know the answer. Nu stepped closer and sat on the floor. He stared at the room's walls, covered with faded pages and ink that had long lost its shine. My father once told me, Nu said, that there are verses which can only be written by the broken and only read by those not yet shattered. Anwar nodded. He understood. One cold night, as Baghdad was wrapped in heavy rain, Anwar wrote something he had never dared write in all his life. He wrote Malik's name for the first time since his son disappeared. Black ink on a plain white page. Just one word, Malik. And beneath it he penned, "If you're still alive, forgive me for my silence. If you are gone, forgive me for still hoping." He placed the writing inside a small wooden box alongside the calligraphy of Surah Al-Inshirah that Nu had returned to him. And the next morning, something changed. The dawn air felt warmer. The oil lamp, which usually flickered in fatigue, glowed steadily. Even the distant cry of a rooster sounded clearer. As though the city of Baghdad itself was opening its eyes alongside the man who had never spoken a single letter aloud, except with ink and stillness. In the weeks that followed, Anwar's house slowly began to draw young visitors. They were not students. They did not come to learn Naskhi or Thuluth calligraphy. They came because they had heard that an old man was writing about loss, and that his words could make people weep, even if they didn't know whom he was writing about. Some brought letters from fathers lost in war. Some brought names that were never buried. Some came only to sit in silence, to watch Anwar's pen move and cry. And Anwar began to understand that perhaps loss was a language everyone understood, but only a few could write. One morning, a young woman came carrying a small cedar wood box. She called out to Anwar with a trembling voice, "Do you write calligraphy for fathers who are no longer here?" Anwar nodded. The woman opened the box, revealing a letter stained with long-dried tears. Inside was her husband's name, Dash, and the last 3 words he had written before he died. "I never made it home." Anwar asked no questions. He simply took his pen and a sheet of paper. Calmly, he wrote one sentence beneath those 3 words. "But we waited for you in prayer." The woman wept, and Anwar remained silent, because in that moment, between ink and tears, the two of them were writing the same prayer, a prayer that could not be spoken aloud. There are nights so dark, not a single star is visible, but that doesn't mean the stars are gone. They are simply in hiding, like prayers not yet answered, or names not yet called again. Nights like that often came to Anwar. They were not frightening nights, nor were they bitterly cold. They were simply silent. A silence that pierced the air. The kind that made every tick of the clock feel like an echo from the past. And within that silence, Anwar kept writing. He lit a small oil lamp beside the window. The mist of dawn was beginning to settle, though not yet thick enough to obscure the silhouette of the mosque's minaret in the distance. Between the footsteps of the night watchman and the faint patter of rain on the roof, Anwar unrolled an old piece of parchment. It wasn't a new page. It was paper that had been folded and handled by time and sorrow. He began to write with ink darker than he usually used. "To the night that never hated the dawn," he wrote. He penned the opening line with care. For Anwar, the night was never an enemy. The night was a place where questions were born, but not answered too quickly. Where secrets weren't hidden, but allowed to grow. The night did not despise the dawn. It yearned for it. Memories that come through scent. There are days when memories come through sound. But that night, they arrived through scent. The smell of cinnamon wafting from a neighbor's home. The scent of wet wood slowly burning in a clay stove. The sharp, nostalgic aroma of old ink from a bottle long sealed shut. All of it opened page after page of memories that Anwar had tucked away into the folds of countless silent nights. He thought of his wife, a simple woman who never asked him to write her name in elegant calligraphy. A woman who didn't know the difference between Kufi and Diwani scripts, but always knew when he needed a wordless embrace. She was gone. And now, only the traces of her life lingered. Scents that once clung to her shawls, the familiar sound of her wooden slippers, now buried in memory. The arrival of a man who spoke nothing. That night, as Anwar was writing verses about patience, there came a soft knock on his weathered wooden door. 3 knocks. Hesitant, but firm enough to wake the silence. He opened the door and found an elderly man in a faded cloak. He carried nothing but a piece of bread and a folded white cloth. He didn't speak a word. Anwar invited him inside. Without exchanging a single word, the man sat beside the lamp and slowly unwrapped the cloth. Inside were old letters, trembling handwriting, incomplete sentences, thoughts left hanging. "Are these letters that were never sent?" Anwar asked softly. The man nodded. "To whom?" The man pointed upward, to the sky. That night, Anwar lit a stick of agarwood incense. They sat together in silence, reading the letters, not with voices, but with their hearts. And for the first time, Anwar wrote without a pen. He simply listened. Letters that were never delivered. In the days that followed, Anwar began to receive more visitors. But they were not guests bearing praise. They came carrying wounds. Some brought fragments of letters from lovers lost in war. Others came with nothing but a name scribbled on worn-out parchment. One boy came holding a napkin with a line scribbled in faded ink. "I will return before winter ends." But winter had long passed, and the one who promised had never returned. Anwar decided to gather all these undelivered letters. He began transcribing them one by one, using ink thick with patience. He copied them onto large sheets and hung them on the walls of his small room. People stopped calling it the calligrapher's house. They began calling it the place where lost prayers were written anew. The dawn call and the final page. One morning, when the first call to prayer echoed faintly from afar, Anwar felt a heaviness in his body. Not pain dash, but the weight of being summoned to rest. He unrolled his final scroll of parchment. With a trembling hand, he wrote in elegant Thuluth script, "And do not think of those who are martyred in the path of God as dead. Rather, they are alive, but you do not perceive it." Having finished the verse, he gently blew out the candle, and he smiled. That dawn was not an ending. It was the beginning of letters only light could read. While the last dew still clung to the glass windows of Masjid al-Karim, and the call to dawn prayer drifted softly through narrow alleys still wrapped in silence, Musa sat once again in his small room facing east. The candle that had accompanied him through the night had burned out, leaving a pool of hardened wax like a tiny frozen lake atop the pottery dish. He had not slept that night, nor had he written. He merely sat, staring blankly at the untouched parchment, as though the letters that once danced at the tip of his brush had chosen to fast alongside him. Outside, the sound of sandals brushing the cold cobblestones announced the steps of early worshippers. But Musa did not move. His gaze was fixed on a single point on the wall, a tiny crack that curved into a shape resembling an inverted M. And for some reason on that particular morning, he felt that it was from that very crack that his past had begun to seep back in, like a spring emerging from stone. Once his name was known throughout Baghdad, Musa al-Khattat, the calligrapher entrusted with transcribing rare Andalusian prayers, engraving secret letters from scholars, even inscribing the names of Allah upon the ancient mosque doors that now lay buried beneath centuries of dust. But what no one knew was that behind every stroke of ink, Musa held one secret. He only wrote at dawn, and he could never touch the letter M without trembling. It all began at a small spring outside the city, a place known only to Sufis and children. It was there that young Musa often sat with his teacher, a blind man named Sheikh Hamad, who taught him that letters were not mere shapes, but prayers in motion. Every curve was an intention, every dot a secret. And among all the Arabic letters, Mam was the hardest, for it was the letter of Muhammad, the letter of Marifa, the letter that bore the deepest mystery of mercy. You cannot write Mam until you recognize yourself in silence, Sheikh Hamad once said one afternoon, as golden sunlight shimmered upon the water's surface. Because Mam is not just a letter, it is a doorway. Time passed, and the grown Musa forgot many things, especially the spring. He wrote for caliphs, for markets, for travelers wishing to carry home prayers in scrolls. But ever since Sheikh Hamad's death, he had never written Mam with peace. Whenever that letter appeared in his work, his hand would tremble, his heart would race, and he knew something was missing. Like a candle burning without a wick, light without a soul. That morning, as the mosque's dome began to cast its shadow across his floor, Musa rose. He took no brush, no parchment, only a thin robe and the warmth of a memory. He walked through a city slowly waking. Bakers lit their ovens. Chickens and donkeys called from back alleys, and the scent of firewood crept gently into the morning air. His destination was clear: the spring, the place long forgotten, perhaps even dried up. But Musa knew that before he could write again, before he could write Mam without fear, he had to return to the place where the letter had first spoken to him. His walk along the city's edge brought back sounds of childhood, laughter, prayer, and quiet sobs. He saw again the faces that had passed, some through memory, Others whispered on the wind, and when at last he arrived at the spring, he found it still there. Hidden behind brush, its waters no longer crystal clear, yet still flowing. He sat on the stone where he once learned. The air felt colder now, but his heart began to warm. And there, for the first time in years, Musa did not feel alone. "You have returned," said a voice, soft as a shadow. Perhaps only the wind, but for Musa, it was enough. He closed his eyes, and in the damp stillness of dawn, he wrote again, within his soul, one letter, one breath, one prayer. And the spring felt clearer that day. Musa returned from the spring before noon. His steps were slow but no longer weary. Beneath the creases of his face, still dusted with the road's embrace, there was a glimmer of light that hadn't been seen in years. The hem of his robe was wet, a sign that he had touched the water with both hands, perhaps even with his face. When he arrived at his small home at the end of the leather crafter's alley, an old cat greeted him with a lazy purr from the doorway. He simply smiled, opened the door without a sound, and stepped into a silence that now felt familiar, no longer tormenting. On his table, the parchment from the night before still lay open. The brush remained unmoved, the ink sat still in a small bowl, and the light of morning had given way to the shadows of noon. Musa sat down and looked once again at the blank sheet, but this time he did not wait. His right hand reached for the brush, dipped it slowly, and wrote the first letter, Mim. No tremble, no hesitation. And somehow, the ink looked darker than usual, thicker yet weightless, as if each drop carried the very water from the spring that had touched his fingertips earlier that day. As if Sheikh Hamad stood behind him, nodding silently. For the next 2 hours, Musa wrote with the rhythm of a prayer the heart remembers, not merely copying, but enlivening. Each letter seemed to breathe. Every dot held a pause that healed. He was composing a long supplication commissioned by a merchant from Samarkand, a prayer meant to adorn the walls of a madrasa. But this time, Musa was not writing for a request. He was writing because the time had come, because he had returned to being the Musa who once sat by a spring and believed that letters, like human beings, were each born with a soul. By late afternoon, as the sun tilted westward and golden light slipped through the lattice windows, Musa stopped. He was not tired, but like a muezzin who knows when to fall silent after the adhan, he knew when the final letter had spoken enough. He blew gently on the last stroke and set the brush aside. That was when he heard the soft knock on the door. A young man stood outside. His face was clean, his eyes anxious but clear. In his hands he held a roll of cloth, and from the way he bowed his head, Musa knew this was not a guest, but a student. "Is this the home of Musa al-Khattat?" he asked. "This isn't a home," Musa replied with a smile. "Just a place where letters are written." The young man exhaled in relief. He introduced himself as Idris, the son of a glassworker from Basra, who had heard that in Baghdad there was a calligrapher who only wrote at dawn. "I want to learn, not just to write letters, but to read their meaning." Musa invited him in. He promised nothing, no teachings, no certificate. only offered an empty stool across the table. "If you want to learn the letters," he said, "start with silence, because letters are born from stillness." The days that followed began to change, slowly but certainly. Idris came every dawn. He helped prepare the ink, cleaned the table, even brewed tea that felt like an old friend's warmth. Musa did not teach right away. He simply let the young man sit, observe, and listen to the stories that Musa told without being asked. Stories of letters he once feared to touch, of the spring, of Sheikh Hamad, and of phrases that could bring tears with a single curve of a letter. One day, Idris asked, "Why does your ink never dry, Master Musa?" Musa smiled. He knew the question wasn't about the ink bowl, but about the spirit that remained unspent, even in old age. "Because I no longer write to be seen," he said. "I write to heal. These letters aren't mine. They only stop here for a while, because they know I won't boast of them." Idris nodded. He was beginning to understand that being a calligrapher wasn't just about graceful hands or sharp eyes, but a clear heart. And in silence, he too began to write. Slowly, imperfectly, but with the intention Musa recognized. The same intention he once found beside the spring. That night, after Idris went home and Musa was alone again in his small room, he looked at his brush resting beside the ink bowl. The ink was not yet finished, but Musa knew. As long as he wrote with the awareness that every letter was a trust, the ink would never dry. He closed the window softly. The winds of Baghdad carried the scent of soil freshly kissed by rain. And in that sacred silence, Musa whispered to himself, "Tomorrow I will write Shad, the letter of patience. But tonight, let Mim be enough." He blew out the candle, and the night preserved the letters in a darkness full of blessing. Dawn returned to Baghdad, cloaked in soft shades of copper. Musa had awakened even before the first rooster's call pierced the still air. The sound of dew dripping from the roof onto the courtyard stones served as a kind of signal, and he rose from his prayer mat with a heart wide open. Outside, the wind had not yet begun to stir, and the sky still held the last silence of night. But within that small room, warmth had already awakened, an oil lantern glowing gently, a cup of ink dark and calm, and a new sheet of parchment clean and waiting. That day Musa intended to write the letter Shad. He did not know exactly why that letter had arrived this morning, but he had learned that letters come like guests, rarely invited, but always to be honored. Shad, with its upright spine and curled secret, is the letter of Saber, patience, a letter never far from the path of those who walk without haste. Idris arrived as usual, bringing 2 cups of bitter tea and a piece of flatbread from the bakery near the Kark Mosque. He placed them carefully on a thin cloth, then sat without a word. He already understood. Morning was not the time for questions. Morning was the time for listening, and listening did not always involve ears. "Today," Musa said as he dipped his brush, "we write the letter most seldom touched, but most often lived." Idris nodded, though he didn't yet fully understand. Musa drew the first line slowly. His aged hand remained steady, though a fine tremor moved through it, not from age, but meaning. Shad does not allow just anyone to write it. It is a letter that holds many wounds, but also long-awaited hopes. In its strokes, there is firmness without harshness, and gentleness without fragility. "Did you know," Musa said, still writing, "that one of Sheikh Hamad's best students was named Shadiq?" Idris shook his head. He came from far away, from Dihlau. His writing was so beautiful, even the Sheikh acknowledged it. But he studied for only 2 seasons. At the end of the second, he left Baghdad. No farewell. He simply left behind a letter. Musa paused. He opened a small box in his desk drawer and drew out an old scroll. Its color had yellowed, but the folds were still sharp. He handed it to Idris. "Read it." Idris opened it slowly. The handwriting inside was delicate and dense. It was not an apology, nor an explanation. It was a confession that Shadiq felt the letters had become too beautiful for him, that he feared loving beauty more than truth, that he chose to stop before the letters became idols in his heart. Idris was silent for a long time after reading. "He wasn't wrong," Musa said softly. "Sometimes we must know when to stop loving, so love doesn't change into something else." That day, they copied Shad in many forms. In Basmala, in Sabr, in Mushafa, which means clarity. Musa explained that each variation was not random, but a different road to the same understanding. Just like patience, it can come through silence, through tears, through labor, or through an unfinished prayer. When the sun had risen high and the duha light warmed the adobe walls of the alley, Musa looked up from the page. He stared out the window, then spoke. "There is one letter that always comes after Shad in the alphabet," he said. "Dad?" Idris replied. "Correct. The letter that only the Arab tongue holds. But do you know what comes after patience in life?" Idris waited. Sometimes not an answer, sometimes just awareness, and that's enough. That evening, after Idris left later than usual, Musa sat once more in his small room. He rolled up Shadiq's letter and returned it to its place. Then he opened a fresh sheet and wrote a single line. Not every letter must arrive, but every word written with sincerity will find its way. He wrote it with a full, sweeping shed at the center of the sentence. And for the first time in many years, Musa added something he had long avoided. He signed the letter with his own name, Musa bin al-Ashbagh. Then he gently blew on the ink still drying. And the world, somehow, felt a little lighter. The morning air in Baghdad that day felt like a symphony unfinished. A thin mist clung to the narrow alleys of Kark, and the small birds flew slower, as if even time hesitated to move. Musa sat once again in his workroom, this time with a letter not only rare but sacred. Dad. Dad is not just a letter, it is an identity, the only letter in all the world's alphabets that exists solely in Arabic. That is why Arabic is called Lugat ad-Dad, the language of Dad. But Musa did not reach for his brush right away. He stared at the blank parchment in front of him, like a man who had just seen the face of an old beloved in a crowd. Dad, he whispered, is a letter heavier than its sound. It rests not only on the tongue, but in the heart. Idris arrived earlier than usual, carrying black raisins in a cloth pouch and 2 bitter oranges. Musa smiled when he saw him. "It's time you tasted something that's not sweet," he said, slicing one of the oranges. They sat together, in silence. Then Musa began to speak. That appears in Dulm, in justice, and also in Diya, radiant light. It bears both sides of life, sorrow and illumination. It lives in pain, but also in clarity. Finally, Musa dipped his brush. His first strokes did not form a letter, but dots. 1, 2, 3. Then he drew a downward curve, swept upward, and returned down like a broken bow. That demands patience of technique and steadiness of soul. Many avoid this letter while learning. Difficult to write, harder to pronounce. But I think that's the point. It mirrors life. Idris leaned in. What do you mean? That what is most difficult is often what we most need to bear. To bear wounds, to bear hope, to bear silence, to bear responsibility. He told the story of a woman from Wasit. Her name was Fadila. She came to Baghdad 20 years ago, wanting to learn to write just one letter, Dad. When asked why only one, she answered, "Because I want to write one name and write it correctly." Fadila, Musa said, came every week, training her tongue and hand not to falter. After years, she finally wrote the name, Abdu Dahir. Her son, lost in war at the border. She wrote no prayer, no poetry, just one name, written perfectly. Then she left and was never seen again. Letters, Musa said, can be the gentlest form of farewell. Idris sat quietly. That day, they wrote Dad in many forms. In Dulm, Dia, Dikr, and Rada, acceptance. Musa explained that though heavy on the tongue, the letter carries a flexible depth of meaning. It represents the vast contrasts of life. Between dark and light, weight and ease, loss and discovery. The Arab tongue has carried the weight of Dad since the beginning, Musa said. But not only phonetically, because Dad teaches us to hold, to train truthfulness in speech. When noon crept near, Musa unrolled an old notebook filled with scribbles. He pointed to one page where a single sentence had been written and rewritten. Man lam yahmil dad fa lisanihi, la yahmil shidq fa qalbi. Whoever cannot carry that on his tongue cannot carry truth in his heart. Then Musa spoke softly, almost to himself. I once wanted to erase this letter from my poems, but I realized it's precisely because it's so hard to write that the poem becomes complete. That afternoon, as the wind rose from the Tigris and carried fine dust to the bent wooden window in Musa's room, the old calligrapher wrote Dad one last time that day. He wrote it with a hand slightly trembling, ending it with a dot, placed just outside the form. Idris asked, "What's that?" "A mistake." Musa smiled. "Number, it's deliberate. Not every ending must fit within the form." Idris stared at the letter for a long time. Then he whispered, "Dad is the letter that reminds us not everything difficult should be feared." And that night, Baghdad seemed to hold its breath just a little longer, so that the letter would not vanish too quickly from the air. That day, the sky over Baghdad looked like an old parchment smeared with fog. The sun only touched the earth faintly, reflected behind layers of gray clouds. Musa loved mornings like this, mornings that demanded nothing of him, mornings that allowed one to drift into reverie. He sat in his small room, No lantern lit, as the dim light from outside was enough. Before him lay a fresh piece of parchment, a fine brush, and ink that had been stirred since dawn. This time, he knew which letter would arrive. Since the night before, he had dreamed of it. Nun. A letter with a dot above it, like a bowed head holding a world within. Idris arrived late that morning. His sandals were wet, and the hem of his robe was stained with mud. "Forgive me, master," he said, placing down a bundle of bread and 2 cups of tea. Musa only nodded. He pointed to the seat across from him. "Today we write the letter that contains oceans," he said. "None?" guessed Idris. "Yes, the letter from Nar, river, from Nur, light, from Nafs, soul." Musa dipped his brush into ink and drew a gentle curve. Its end arched rightward like a boat moving against the current. Above it, a small black dot floated, as if a compass. "Once," said Musa as he kept writing, "there was an old scribe in Kufa. His name was Nasruddin. He copied only 1 chapter in his entire life, Surah Al-Nun, but he copied it 1,000 times. Not because he didn't know other chapters, but because he felt his life was trapped in that single letter." "Why?" asked Idris, surprised. "Because every time he wrote the letter Nun, he felt he was writing his own destiny. He had lost a son to the Tigris River, drowned when a sudden storm came. Since then, every word containing Nun became a form of pilgrimage for him." Idris bowed his head. He began copying the letter Nun on his practice parchment. His lines were not yet perfect, but he tried. "This letter," continued Musa, "teaches us to accept what cannot return. The dot above it, some scholars say, symbolizes something once whole, now only a memory, but it remains part of the letter." Idris stopped writing. "Master, does every person have their own letter?" Musa looked at his student for a long moment. "Not everyone knows it, but every heart surely holds one letter, always waiting to be written." Rain began to fall outside. Its patter was light, but enough to turn the streets into mud. Musa stood, then took a parchment from the top shelf. He showed it to Idris, written in large, elegant script, وَلَقَدْ نَادَنَا نُوحٌ فَلَنِعْمَ الْمُجِيبُونَ. And indeed, Noah called upon us, and we are the best of responders. Musa looked out at the rain. The letter Nun appears repeatedly in the story of Nuh. It floated on the flood, yet did not sink, like hope. That day, they wrote the letter Nun until just before Asr. Each stroke, each dot became more than ink. They were unseen steps toward forgiveness, understanding, and acceptance. When Idris bid farewell, Musa walked him to the doorway. The mud still clung to the earth, and Idris's sandals left deep impressions behind. "Be careful on the road," said Musa. "Insha'Allah," Idris replied. Musa watched the footprints Idris left in the mud. Then he looked at his own hand, still holding the brush. He returned inside, opened a new parchment and wrote, "Sometimes the holiest thing is not the prayer that ascends to the sky, but the letter born of mud that still strives to stay unsoiled." He wrote it with a large nun, then set down the brush, and for a long time simply sat there, listening to the rain and letting himself dissolve into the small dot above the curve of that letter. In Baghdad, dawn is not merely the light rising from the horizon, but a daily miracle that always made Musa feel that life had not finished telling its story. the morning breeze slipped through the slats of the window, carrying the scent of earth, just touched by dew. The birds were still quiet, as if the sky itself was still deciding whether the day deserved to be sung. Musa sat in his workroom, as always. But this morning, he did not immediately reach for his brush or unroll any parchment. He simply stared outward, at the sky slowly turning blue. Something had changed in his gaze. Like a traveler who knows the road ahead will not lead back to the same place. "Idris," he called softly. His student came in from the back room, carrying a small jug of rose water and a copper bowl for washing hands. "Wash your hands, then sit. Today we write the last letter." Idris paused. "The last letter of what, master?" Musa didn't answer right away. He opened the long scroll they had filled together, letter by letter, from Alif, upright like a first prayer, to Nun, curved like sorrow that has been accepted. There was still space at the end of the parchment. "The letter Ya," Musa finally said. "A letter that closes, but also opens." He dipped his brush in ink. His hand trembled slightly, but he still traced the lines with care. The letter Ya in his hand looked like two hands reaching, not grasping, like surrender, but not defeat. "Ya," he said, "is the letter of Ya Rabba, the most silent cry, yet the deepest." Idris copied the letter onto his practice sheet. He repeated it several times until the form finally resembled his teacher's. Musa looked at the result and nodded. Each letter in this scroll is a prayer without sound. They sat in silence for some time. Then Musa stood, took a cloth from the drawer and covered the long scroll. He tied it with string, then handed it to Idris. "Keep this. It is not a legacy. It is a reminder." Idris received it with both hands. "Master, does this mean?" Musa gave a faint smile. "Every calligrapher must know when to stop writing, just as dawn knows when to stop being night." That day they wrote no more. They only sat, listening to morning slowly become day. The birds began to sing. The light grew stronger, and in his heart Musa knew he had written all the letters necessary to compose the sentence of his life. One last letter, written not on paper, but in the heart of his student. And that letter, though invisible, would live on in every step Idris took, in every drop of ink that fell on quiet mornings, in every invocation not answered by man, but whispered amen by the sky. The end. And so it is. Every letter he wrote was never shouted, but quietly absorbed, like water into soil, or dicker into the chest. He never wished to be known, never asked to be praised. He only wished to write before the world grew too loud to listen again. If your eyes are not yet fully closed, that's perfectly all right. Our voices will remain here, beside you, until dawn arrives. Thank you for sleeping with us tonight. To you in Utrecht, in Lahore, and to the one sitting silently by a small window in Parepare. Don't forget to return tomorrow night, because our stories will always be waiting at the edge of silence, here on Sleepthrum.